Afternoon. Welcome to the panel titled Endless War, the Future of Syria and Iraq. My name is Benedetta Berti. I am a research fellow at the INSS, and I will be moderating this session. With me, joining me on stage to talk about what seems to be a rather grim situation, we have four distinguished panelists. To my right, Mr. Dekel, Managing Director of the INSS. General John Allen, who needs no introduction, but currently co-director of the Center for the 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings. Mr. David Ignatius, associate editor at the Washington Post and longtime analyst and commentator of the Middle East with a focus on Syria. And our newest addition to the panel, very welcome, Dr. Dmitry Mariasis, senior research associate at the Russian Academy of Science. So we have much to talk about and not a lot of time, but let me just start by giving a very short frame of what I want to discuss in the next 5 minutes with our panelists. And I want to go back to some of the numbers we saw in the video. Before we delve into the geopolitics, I think some of these numbers really need to sink in so we can better understand what are the magnitude of the tragedy that is unfolding under our very own eyes. In the past 5 years, it's not only 500,000 people that have been killed in the Syrian civil war, but it's also a systematic strategy of attacks against the civilian population, what the United Nations has called crimes against humanity on an industrial scale. 5 years of war have produced over 5 million refugees, and these are the official numbers by the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. The actual number, of course, broader. Most of the refugees are today in our neighboring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. In addition, we have more than 6 million people internally displaced within Syria, a country of 22 million people. Half of Syrians, 30 million people now, depend on humanitarian assistance to survive. The last IMF research tells us 2/3 of Syrians currently live in extreme poverty. And the World Bank has done a study and has told us, even if this stops tomorrow, it will take up to 20 years to rebuild Syria. So these are some of the sobering facts. I could go on forever, but I won't, because we have much to talk about and not a lot of time. So these are some of the sobering facts. And while we're talking here in Tel Aviv, a few kilometers away from us, in Astana, in Kazakhstan, under the auspices of Turkey, of Iran, and of Russia, there are talks going on. I want to start by talking about these talks. I want to begin by talking about what's happening in Astana. Let me start with you, Mr. Ignatius. I would love to ask you about if you can give us a quick update, post-Aleppo. What's the reality right now? Many observers are telling us that this is the time, that this time in Astana there is a political will, and that we're moving forward, and perhaps this political talks happening in Geneva at the beginning of February will be successful. Is that just a bunch of dreams? Where do we stand today?
I think Astana is a good restart for the process that led to the agreement on cessation of hostilities in March of last year that Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov worked on, but just got stalled. In effect, the conquest of the opposition in Aleppo marks a moment in which I think there's exhaustion, a desire on the part of much of the opposition to think about negotiation. The Astana process is interesting and noteworthy because it's a Russian-led process and symbolizes a Russia, Turkey, Iran coalescence trying to make an agreement. I'm assuming, and Dmitry will tell us, that Russia would like, if you think of Syria as being like Lebanon, it's now decomposed into different statelets, different cantons. Russia would like Astana to be like the Taif Conference, which restored the integrity of a unitary Lebanese state. The idea that I heard General Petraeus express at this conference that a Russia-U.S. process could lead to acceptance of this decomposed Syria acceptance of the cantons. I just don't think that that's what Russia or its key client, Bashar al-Assad, are seeking. They want a country called Syria. So I have to say, as a starting point, I don't think Astana is Taif. I don't think this is the moment in which it's possible to put the pieces back together. As I remember Lebanon, there was a long period from the end of the formal civil war in 1976 to the Taif agreement in 1989, in which there was a reduction of violence. And what was important about that period was that the instruments of the Lebanese state continued. There was a president, there was a prime minister, there was a parliament. They didn't do anything, they didn't have any effect, but they continued. And one of the questions I have for members of the panel is that a realistic model, or instead should the assumption be, for as far forward as we can see, that there won't be a single country we can call Syria?
I think that's an excellent starting point, and I spent quite a bit of my time in Lebanon, and the idea that once we would get to the point where Taif was an ideal to aspire to tells us how bad the situation is, because Taif is full of problems. But I'll take your point and go and ask, of course, our participants from Moscow, what does it look like from Moscow? What I mean is, what are the hopes the Russians are putting on these negotiations? And a broader talk is, do you think Russia has achieved its strategic objectives in Syria? Is it really ready to call it a day? And I will ask you to comment on a specific issue, which is, how do you see the future of Russian presence in Syria? We have contradictory signals. On the one hand, the Kremlin told us we're going to downsize. On the other hand, they've been sending more aircrafts, and they've been signing and promoting this new agreement by which Russia will expand militarily. How do we square all this?
Okay. First of all, we have to remember that Russia, from the beginning, from the 6 years from now, 5 years from now, wanted Syria to be integral part. And now, we still think that we have to preserve Syria as much as possible, but we understand that in the course of this bloodshed, there is a situation that it's almost impossible to come to the united Syria, and the federalization, anyway specifically, could become a solution. What is going on in Astana? Russia is eager and strives to play a fair mediator in the process of, as it looks, to a stabilization of Syria and to start the political transition process. And we think that the Astana is not the solution, it is the start of the process, and that will continue in February in Geneva, and that will continue. It's important to understand that it will continue together with the USA and other countries, because it is impossible to stabilize Syria anyway without joint effort. That's why we're seeking joint effort. We tried in March, now we try with Turkey and Iran now, and we understand that any situation is for us better if we do it together. Our Russian interests are to stay in the region because we consider the Middle East a very close region to Russia, and we want to ensure that terrorism is not coming from the region inside the country. And we know and that's a huge number of 1,000 people from the different parts, especially Islam population parts of Russia. They're crossing the border, they're going to ISIS, and we're afraid of it, and we have to have a grip on it, and the drugs traffic as well. And that's why this is our vested interest in Syria, as well as economic ones. Sure, Syria was our partner for a long time, since the Hafez al-Assad. And we want to preserve our economic interests as well. By the way, till now, there are Russian companies that are still working in the country. And you have to remember that for us, Assad is a legitimate power, and we want to ensure that in this transition period, in this political period, he will be the part of the solution. We don't say, and it's official said, you can find it everywhere, that Russia is not saying that the Assad is the solution. Assad is a part of a political solution, maybe, and we are ready to work whoever is going to become a president. We just want to ensure that the Assad and the people, the Alawites, and who backs Assad, they are part of the future Syria as well.
Great. So, and I'll go back to you in a second about this desire to work with the actors in the region, because I think when we think about the power playing and Russian working with Iran and Turkey, I wonder how long that honeymoon is going to last. But I'll come back to that and ask Mr. Udi Dekel, or Udi because we work together. Anything else will be slightly awkward. What do you think is the role of Assad in the future of Syria? And we have seen a few ideas. One Syria, a de facto partition, one Syria under Assad. What are the options here? What do you see as the scenarios? Easy question.
No, yes, no, I would like to, as we mentioned before, I have another answer. There is very interesting, concept by the pro-Assad coalition. There is pro-Assad coalition leading by the Russians, okay? It's ongoing all the time, the same story. And I would like to mention it, because by that we can understand better the situation, because perceptions are not important. We have to see the acting on the ground. It's starting with attacking people, striving people, then attacking by barrel bombs from helicopters, then escalating the strikes by airplane, fighters, artillery, everything that you can do in order to, destroy that area. Then, from the position of, let's say, advantage of position, offer them ceasefire, then offer them or invitation to peace talks or something like that, explosion of those talks because you can blame the rebels, legitimation of the pro-Assad coalition, and starting again, on and on. And every time we are playing the same rule, we are looking, we have a lot of expectation. This coalition, pro-Assad coalition, cannot accept any scenario which Assad is not staying in his position, which Syria is not unified within its own borders. You can find the idea of federal, that there will be, local communities which will take care about the communities and the area of the communities and giving the governors some control, but they have to obey to the central regime. And the central regime by the Russians, by the Iranians, by those which supporting them, it's Assad. And this is the main problem, because nobody in Syria today can accept Assad as the president of Syria after the killing of so many people, as nobody can accept the ISIS. Okay, it's Assad and ISIS. This is the main obstacle for any future of Syria. And all these stories kind of play which is going all around until the pro-Assad coalition, leading by Russia, will destroy all the other options for Syria, for the future of Syria.
So, I led the applause, and then General, and I saw you nodding at a certain point, and I think the characterization of what has been a ferociously punitive counterinsurgency war by the Syrian regime, targeting civilians, and to ultimately crush the opposition, I think that's a fair characterization. But the question that I have going forward is there do you see it as a realistic possibility that Assad and his regime, of what's left of it, because it's a very different regime than in 2011, but let's say this creature that exists right now, that they will go after regaining control of the whole of Syria? Or would this be a hollow, or are they looking for a no hollow solution where they are in control of quote-unquote useful Syria, which is this expression everybody uses that I'm not sure corresponds to the reality on the ground? But that's my question.
Well, it's a good question. Let me first thank General Yadlin for a magnificent conference. I would simply depict it as an experience, and I have doubled my blood pressure medicine now because of that. This has been a terrific conference, and I want to thank you for letting me participate. To your question, I think I'm not in Damascus, and I'm not inside Bashar al-Assad's head. I'm not sure anyone is. But I would simply say that while his public rhetoric would seem to imply a desire to unite Syria, again, under his rule, and of course he'll need allies to do that, whether it's Russia and Iran, with some help from Turkey along the northern border with respect to the Islamic State. I think that's going to be his rhetoric. But I think the reality is going to be that for a long time, he's going to have to be satisfied with what we can call the Alawi bastion, the western portion of Syria. That's defined both by a concentration of population, but also strategic terrain, which makes the defense of that region possible. Russia has made the consolidation. It's not done yet. Russia has made the consolidation possible for him there, but his capacity militarily without Russia to move out beyond the bastion, I think, is virtually zero. He hasn't shown really any real capability, even with Russian help, to be tactically relevant in some cases. And the Russians have paid a big price, frankly, for providing that assistance to him. So I would say that in the short term, regardless of his rhetoric, we're going to see an Alawi bastion in the West with some conversation at some point, I think, between the United States and the counter-ISIL coalition and Russia about how there can be some form of cooperation, greater cooperation conceivably to deal with Daesh. But, and I don't want to relitigate the American policy here, which was a patchwork policy at best. But we have at this juncture the sort of surreal reality that we have a 65-nation coalition bearing down on Daesh along the Euphrates and in the eastern part of Syria, at the same time not dealing necessarily and decisively with this al-Qaeda element, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which is a large, very influential group, which could in fact be the spoiler for any peace effort that will be undertaken by Russia or others. And then we have the regime which continues relentlessly to strike those elements of the Syrian population which the United States believed all along ought to be part of the solution politically for some form of a transition ultimately to remove Bashar al-Assad. So we have a lot of nearly irreconcilable at this point differences that we're going to need to come to grips with. I would simply say, though, and your question didn't ask this, you know, we in the last panel, BDS, we talked about 2017 as a year of multiple challenges. And if you look at the timeline, there are a lot of anniversaries there, which I would propose for Israel and for the greater community of nations. We ought to see them as opportunities. And we need to seize the opportunity in Astana with the Russians. The Russians are pragmatic. They're very pragmatic in this regard, and they have the cards in their hands. But there will be no solution to Syria without the United States and without Syria. And every moment that the United States is excluded from this process intentionally by Iran or by the coalescence of Turkey and Russia and Bashar al-Assad and those four, every moment that the United States is excluded from that process makes the process harder in the long term. And so if we're looking for an opportunity for the new Trump administration, for where we can seek a palpable process forward, here is the opportunity for the Trump administration and Russia to seek common ground on the way ahead. It's difficult to see right now. It's galling to see right now. We live in a world where the tyranny of numbers has made it almost impossible to conceive of 500,000 people dead and millions displaced, and Europe fundamentally remade in a different form. It's difficult to truly get your head around those kinds of numbers. But if we don't get if the U.S. does not, and the Western coalition does not become an active partner in this process, we will never end the violence in Syria. We will never see ourselves in a position, ultimately, where we can move to a road of political transition, which is the only way, in the end, to end the fighting. This is about Bashar al-Assad, not ISIS. ISIS is a symptom of the problem. Bashar al-Assad is the problem.
John, there is only one important thing. As the Russians behave today, they already got from the U.S., from the new administration, the Syrian portfolio.
I don't dispute that one bit. The world we live in right now, the reality of the world we live in right now, unless some of the irreconcilable aspects of the emerging policy in the United States, which will get reconciled as we have the collision between rhetoric and reality. The reality, though, is there can be no peace in the Middle East without an active role of the United States. And we did not maintain the kind of pressure that we needed to have that role. We knew that we could not solve Syria with military means. The Russians recognized, however, that there could be some military activity that could set the conditions ultimately for their side, and they took advantage of that, and we saw that in the summer of 15. So what we need to do is get the United States and the West back into the game on this thing, because the earlier that happens, the more comprehensive the outcome can be. If we don't get that process underway, and this is a matter of opportunity now, not a matter of begging to be in the process, we're going to find that it will be much more difficult in the long term.
Mr. Ignatius, I'm going to continue on that point because I think it really begs to be discussed further. And I have two questions that will merge into one, and I have to do with the role of U.S. policy in Syria. Going forward, before we go forwards, I want to go backwards, and I'm going to ask you, let's say if I give you a time machine and you can go back at any point in the past 5 years and change something with respect to the U.S. administration policy with respect to Syria. What is the time? When do we go back? 2012, 2013? What do we do differently, if anything? And if we don't do anything differently, then I'd like to hear why this is the best possible place for the United States to be. And building on that, I'll ask you, and building on General Allen's comments, given the few options that I see for the United States today in Syria, what can be done?
I'm going to answer your first question very quickly, because I think the debate in the United States has been relentlessly focused on looking backwards and what should have been done. My own quick answer is that in 2012, before ISIS existed formally as a group, when the opposition was a mess, but it was clear that Bashar al-Assad's ability to govern Syria was gone. If the United States had made a significant effort to organize, train the opposition, to bring governance into the areas where the regime could no longer govern, if we'd really done that emphatically, not putting in an army, but putting in the resources needed, this story would be different. When I hear President Obama say that he's proud of the decisions he made, that those were the only decisions possible, I scratch my head. We can't be in a situation where this outcome is the one that we would defend. This is a story of the failure of the United States and its efforts, the failure of the United Nations. The reason that Russia now leads this effort is because of the failure of others who tried. Let me briefly look forward and not backward. Russia now owns this process. And this is Russia's moment not to demonstrate its ability to drop bombs on Syrian opposition or even ISIS, but to lead a complicated, difficult diplomatic process and to use leverage with the other partners in the Astana process to move this story forward. You said that Russia is not committed to Bashar al-Assad governing Syria in the long run. So a clearer signal that Assad's role is only transitional, that it's the integrity of the Alawite community in Syria that matters to Russia, not Bashar al-Assad, would be the day that's really said clearly by Russia is the day that you'll get buy-in from more of the opposition. If you can use your leverage with your partner in Syria, Iran, to discipline Iran, to reduce Iranian meddling in the region in a way that Sunni states no longer feel as threatened by Iran, you'll have more buy-in for this process from Sunni neighbors. It's really in Russia's hands now. I agree with what General Allen said. You can't possibly do it without help from the United States. You have a new and inexperienced administration, but I think you ought to think about using the leverage that you've gained, not for further military gains, but to consolidate this process. Just a final brief comment. The thing that I have been worrying about and writing about for the last year is what does post-ISIS Sunnistan look like in both Syria and Iraq? And I've said sometimes that I'd like to see a 1944 moment. In 1944, when the end of World War II was in sight, but there was still a lot of fighting to do, Franklin Roosevelt had the good sense, working sometimes with partners in Russia, to begin thinking about the institutions that would keep the world stable after the war ended. And so there was the creation of the outlines of the International Monetary Fund to finance trade. There was the creation of the World Bank to finance development. There was the beginning of thinking of about the United Nations structure that would. So that's what the people who really care about this process should be thinking about. Because if there aren't these institutions, we're just going to go through this again and again. I've had this conversation with General Allen often. You know, it's going to be ISIS 2.0 and then ISIS 3.0, and for the rest of our lives we'll be dealing with versions of this unless there's more attention to this problem.
Let me just add as well, and David's points about Russia's relationship with Iran in this process is really important, because if Iran continues to dominate this process, for example, if Iran wanted no American presence in Astana, if it hadn't been for the Russian intervention, we wouldn't have even gotten our ambassador in the room. Now, okay, thank you for that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
But the point is, when the appearance of the Iranian Shia enclave in this process is going to be very difficult to overcome unless we get the West involved in this process. Because the appearance, once again, of the Alawi regime, the Iranian IRGC Quds Force, and the Hezbollah elements, whenever an artillery piece was fired or a bomb was dropped or a rocket was shot, it landed on Sunni Arabs or Sunni elements within the Syrian population. This is going to be, it's going to take a very long time to reconcile that process at the ground level. This is why we've got to create greater diversity in the process ultimately for the voices that are at the table to bring the fighting to an end. And to the point of our Russian colleague here, the sooner, and David's point, the sooner we can make it very clear that Bashar al-Assad's time in office is going to be terminated in the relatively near future, this will be an enormous balm and a calming, ultimately, to the willingness of the Syrians to fight forever. If they believe he'll be in office forever, they will fight forever. The sooner we can convince them with a credible process that he will be transitioning out, the more likely we'll get to a cessation of hostilities that will mean something.
Dr. Mariasis, I have to ask you, how do you relate to these comments? Do you see any window of opportunity for Russia to adopt a shift in the way it portrays the role of Bashar al-Assad? And do you see it changing its ways in approaching the opposition? Is this something that is on the table? And if so, how will it deal with its Iranian allies? And could or will that be a source of friction?
I just want to remind you one thing. Iran is quite close to Russia. And for many hundreds of years, Russia has to deal with Iran, even though we're not so happy with it for many years. And one of our ambassadors was killed by Iran some time ago. But we still have to deal with Iran because it's rather influential in the region. For example, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, which is former Soviet Union and the region of our interest. Second, you remember that for the first 3 years in the civil war in Syria, Russia was not there. It was a war, and there were the weapons supplies by with the money of Saudi Arabia, and Russia wanted to calm down the situation. And you remember this chemical weaponry deal that Russia put a huge pressure on Assad to make this deal. We don't think that Assad is the nice guy. And it is said openly that he's done a lot of blunders. And still, for example, a couple of days ago, the center that is looking after on the armistice blamed heavily Syrian army, the Assad army, on not being compliable to the armistice because we don't want Assad to make fools of us. It is one thing. Another thing, I think that just yesterday, Russia and Turkey with some kind of coordination, or informational coordination with the US, bombed in Al-Bab, the ISIS stronghold. We want to use our ability to have good working relations with all the local superpowers, including Israel, by the way, which we have very good communication on the Syrian issue, in order to understand their position and to use it for the transition period. I don't understand about Assad one thing. Let me say one thing. Just when the civil war began, I got a call from the New York Times correspondent. He said that why Russians, for Assad. I said, okay, let me ask you a question. Who will be next? Assad is gone. That's it. Who's going to be? We know the answer, for example, now we know an answer in Egypt that used to be Morsi, for example. Who was happy with that? I will give you another example. I will give you an example in the Palestine elections. There were elections, and lots of people were saying maybe in Israel that maybe it will be not Fatah who will be the leaders. Hamas came to power after the elections because there was not a proper, I think, political transition period. And now, for example, people say that why Russia is speaking to Hamas, for example, as you say about Iran, for example, because Hamas now is the official political power after the election that they won. It is important to understand that it is a multifaceted game, and you can't just say, okay, they won the elections and Assad won the election, but he's a bad guy, let's put him off. You can't do it.
Wait.
Dimitri, in the Middle East, it's not important who is voting. It's important who is accounting. Okay? I
have a question for you, and you can then answer with a different answer, but I will ask you the question anyway. So at least I'm here to do something and to redress the gender balance in the panel. So because.
And we're fully supportive of that.
I get to ask the question. So let's go back. I hear that argument at the beginning. We don't know what's coming next. The opposition is mixed. From my point of view, there's a lot of self-fulfilling prophecy in portraying it as with Assad or with the terrorists. But I think there are some keywords that I picked in the past few minutes: ICRG, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran. What about Israel? How is Israel seeing it all? What are the Israeli interests here? What are the red lines? What is the Israeli policy being, and what should it be going forward? And then answer also the other questions, but I also would like you to address this part.
Okay, so I'll start with that. First of all, I can say that for Israel, as I see the situation, Israel takes very responsible policy not to intervene in the situation in Syria, because any kind of intervention by Israel, it would change the focus from one problems to other problems. And it was clever. And the only idea was that only if there is an imminent threat to Israel, we have to operate in order to protect ourselves. Imminent threat for me is also delivery of advanced Russian or Iranian weapon systems to Hezbollah in Lebanon, or to Hezbollah in Syria, or something in the Golan Heights. This is the first one. The second red line, which was very important, that Israel cannot accept any Iranian dominance, especially in southern Syria and the Golan Heights, or Iranian deployment of the Shia militias and the other proxies, especially Hezbollah, in the Golan Heights. And 2 years ago, we took, some kind of attempt to try to initiate activities or even infrastructure of these forces in the Golan Heights, and they understood the message. I don't know what will be in the future, but they understood in that time the message. I'm a little bit, I don't want to say afraid of, I'm worried a little bit that after finishing the problem in the northern part of Syria, they will change the focus, and we already see some activity of Assad coalition around the southern Syria, the Golan Heights, and in that case, Israel has to do something, because Israel cannot accept the Iranian deployment in the Golan Heights. For Israel, this is a big challenge, Iran, because on one side, our friends, the US, have some kind of coordination with the Iranian in Iraq. Okay, deconfliction, this is a nice word. This is coordination. On the other hand, the Iranians are in the coalition leading by other superpower, somebody which believe that it's a superpower in the Middle East, Russia. And the international community believes that the Iranians are responsible, stable, they can help. Nobody look in very good eyes what is going on, what the Iranians doing in Syria today. Changing location of people, Sunni people, away from the border between Lebanon and Syria, fixing the situation in order to create some external perimeter around Lebanon with influence of Iran. They would like their influence along the backbone of Syria from Aleppo to Hama, Homs, Damascus, and of course, the whole area around Lebanon. And for everybody, it's good because maybe it's something which is, contributing for stable situation. It will not. It will not create any stable situation because the majority of the Sunni people cannot accept any dominance by the Iranian. And I would like to say that there is 10, but I will mention 5 steps in the roadmap that Israel have to deliver with coalition of other coalition party, with the US and the international community. The first one, this is the situation. We have, first of all, to arrive to situation, real deadlock that nobody on those major actors in Syria will believe that they can achieve something like decisive outcome. This is first. Second, it's very important through coordination, cooperation, as you said, between the US and Russia. This is very, very important. Third, you said that also. Assad cannot stay in his position. It can be after transition period, but Assad cannot stay in his position as the president of Syria anymore. Fourth, it's very important to defeat ISIS and the jihadist, the Salafist organization, because as long as they are alive, there will be other forces that will try to fight against them, and it will not create any stability in that area. And this is the mission which is leading by the US, and I hope the US will continue in that mission. But there is another important issue. This is the influence of all the other actors in Syria. The Turks in the northern part, and and we spoke about Iran, and we spoke about even Saudi Arabia, which supporting some kind of good guys, moderate. Very nice to use the word moderate. We have to minimize, the international community, have to minimize the influence of those actors, because those actors look at Syria as the battlefield that they can attack and play against their enemies. And they have to stop that negative influence. Only by that. And in this case, maybe Israel have to do something. We started to look upon the idea of creating something bottom-up, especially when we speak about the Golan Heights, to assist the local communities in the Golan Heights, and by that, creating better environment. We can cooperate and coordinate, strategic coordination with Jordan, because Jordan have the same interest to keep the southern Syria stable and calm. And we can do a lot of those things. So we have to do something, because otherwise we will find Iranian, Hezbollah, and other proxies in the Golan Heights.
And I'm gonna build on one of the really interesting things you say, which is we have to defeat ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which is, by the way, today very active while the talks are going on. Jabhat Fatah al-Sham is launching attacks on other opposition groups in Idlib and West Aleppo. So definitely a very key part of the puzzle. And I would like to ask General Allen, where do we stand in terms of these efforts to downgrade and destroy ISIS in Syria and in Iraq? And building on that, how do we stand in having learned about building a more politically inclusive day after, especially in Iraq, in the parts of Iraq that have been liberated, quote unquote, depending on who comes next?
Well, we have 3 minutes and 26 seconds, so in Iraq, the situation is obviously very different than in Syria. Very quickly, Daesh is headed ultimately to destruction. We believe that from the beginning. It ultimately will. That's not the hard part. The hard part for Iraq will be the political outcome. And the microcosm of the difficulty there is exemplified by the difficult political outcomes in and around the recovery of Mosul by itself. So for us, while the defeat of Daesh was always very important on the ground in Iraq, that was not sufficient ultimately for resolving the problem in Iraq, because it was really a political problem in Iraq which gave the opportunities for Daesh ultimately to put down roots in the country. So there is much work still to be done in Baghdad, and as I said, an extension of the enormity of that work can be seen on the ground in and around the recovery of Mosul. For example, the Kurds, the magnificent Peshmerga and other elements that fought so well with the support of the West, recovered a lot of ground that had traditionally been and still is considered to be Arab ground, but has said, where we spilled a drop of Kurdish blood, we will never give that ground up. Look, that is going to be, in and of itself, a very difficult outcome for us to solve. So in Iraq, I see that we will ultimately defeat Daesh as an organized entity. They will go to ground, as they always do. They will break up into small parts. We will see terrorist acts and suicide acts that will continue for some long period of time. The hard part in Iraq is the political outcome that can solidify the gains. In Syria, it's very difficult for me to see in the short term any kind of an outcome that can do away with the causal factors for the emergence of Daesh as a symptom of the conflict in Syria. It is about Bashar al-Assad in the end. We will physically defeat ISIL over the long period of time. And the United States has put lots more special operators in, but we have the dynamic, of course, that the principal fighting force to deal with Daesh in Syria comes under the aegis, if you will, or the leadership of the Kurds. That is immediately anathema to Turkey. Turkey, of course, has a rapprochement with Russia, which makes it even more complicated for us now. So we'll continue to fight Daesh as an entity. The coalition will remain focused there. And that is apart from the larger global issue about Daesh is now a global provincial issue, and Daesh is now a global network. But you asked me about Syria and Iraq, and that's the quickest answer.
Unfortunately, I think how ISIS will evolve will be another very interesting topic that unfortunately we won't have time to address. Instead, I will like to close with a half-a-minute quick fire round, as they call it, starting with you, Mr. Ignatius. Two policies, two concrete policies that your country, in this case the United States, Russia, or Israel, could implement right now to help beginning to stabilize and to shift from this horrific war into a better future.
So in 30 seconds, if I can, the United States has to finish what's been a tougher military campaign than most people recognize. 24/7, the U.S. and its special forces are going after ISIS in Iraq and Syria both, and that job needs to be finished. The battle for Mosul is going to be very difficult. The battle for Raqqa may be even more difficult, and we just have to persist in that and sort out the deep conflict between our Turkish allies and our Syrian Kurdish allies. The military campaign is going in the right direction, has to be finished. The political part of this rests on quicksand, and it must be built in a more solid way. And that is an effort that's going to require Russian-American cooperation. It's going to require Iranian-Saudi cooperation. All of the players who helped destroy Syria are going to have to come together for the political process to work.
Okay, we're just doing this policy actually. Russia in Astana, which we are in. That's the policy to start the political transition process, and including this process as fast as possible. The major players, and in this regard, I agree with General Allen that without USA and without other players, we can't resolve this problem. We can't finalize the political transition. We can't do it, for sure. Another issue, I said that we have to forget about the zero-sum game, because sometimes we hear about it, and we have to work really not to coordinate us or to, kind of detente, but a real to finish the zero-sum games and to play the only game to stabilize the situation in Syria, because it is of our mutual, of the three countries that present here, of our it's our mutual target, it is our mutual goal, even though we look at it from the different angles. So these are just one moment just for you to remember, we're not very happy with that with the Shia, because we would like Iran to be nice Sunni regime, because we have our Sunni population in Russia. We don't have Shia. It's important to understand. Yeah. So that's it.
I think President Ignatius did a very good job of proposing American policy. We must continue to bear down on Daesh in the form that we have found it in what we call core Daesh in Iraq and Syria. I believe the Trump administration has been very clear that it intends to pursue that. But as I mentioned earlier, here is our opportunity, as distasteful as we find the situation today, and going back and doing constant relitigation of the American policy that landed us here is valuable in a historical sense, but it doesn't help us much in the future. Here is an opportunity for the new administration, in a close conversation with Russia, to begin the process of moving us towards a political outcome that can be acceptable to the warring parties on the ground. And until there is some hope among those warring parties that there will be a transition in Damascus into something that is acceptable to all of the parties on the ground, we are going to be fighting forever. But I will also say that we, very soon, Russia, the United States, the counter-ISIL coalition, the broader community of nations, must begin a consideration of addressing more broadly than Syria the long-term factors that sparked the Arab Spring, which became the Arab Nightmare, to get after the causal factors that will produce for us an unending number of extremist organizations in perpetuity. And until we get after that, something along the lines of a grand Marshall approach, a Marshall Plan approach, we're going to be fighting forever. So let's take the steps necessary to deal with this in the short term about Syria. But we as a community of nations must do the diagnosis of what's causing this problem and begin to shape a strategic, long-term strategy that can begin to get at the causal factors.
For Israel, as I said before, first of all, we have to be ready for the scenario of deployment of Hezbollah and Iranian proxy forces in the Golan Heights. And in that case, we have to be ready for escalate the situation there. Second, we have to convince the new administration in the US that Iran cannot be part of the future deal in Syria, because we cannot accept any deal which Iran has dominance in Syria. And as I said before, everybody have to realize we didn't say a word, about the future of Syria until now. Because for Israel, it was not so bad to be in stand of position and to see how the bad guys killing other bad guys. But this is the end of that story. We have to say what the scenario and what kind of endgame we would like to see in Syria, and to share that with our best ally, the US, in order to shape better reality for the future. This is the time to take decisions, not to run away from decisions.
And I think that on that, I think on that note we can start wrapping up the panel. I think we didn't have a lot of time, but we had the chance to discuss a lot of different issues, focusing on really what is the big reality today, that today Syria is the biggest, not just the biggest humanitarian crisis that has been in the world since World War II, but is also the epicenter of instability, violence, and insecurity that ultimately it's not self-contained, it does not stay within the borders of Syria, but it is destabilizing the entire Levant with consequences for global security. So I think it's a really important topic, one that I'm very glad that I had the chance to discuss with you over the past hour. Please join me in thanking the panelists.